cover passive and active diffusion. Now, what passive means is that we don't need to add energy to it in the form of ATP. Active means we do add ATP to it, and it requires ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. We cleave off the phosphate to generate energy. We consider ATP our cellular currency or our cellular form of energy. So when we need to add energy to a reaction, it's in the form of ATP. So we'll start off with passive diffusion. We have something called simple diffusion. Simple diffusion is where we have like lipid-soluble substances that can move right through the cell membrane. They do not need ATP, and they do not need a protein carrier or a channel protein. So they don't need assistance or facilitation from a protein, and they don't need any ATP. What they do is they move down their concentration gradient. In fact, all passive processes, the particles are going to move down their concentration gradient. What that means is they move from high to low. So we talk about something like sodium. Sodium moves from high concentration of sodium to low concentration of sodium. So if we were talking about two sides of a membrane, sodium is going to want to go, it lives primarily outside the cell, it's going to primarily want to go inside the cell because that's the concentration gradient. Now sodium will need a gate, we'll talk about that. But when we're talking about concentration gradient itself, it's the particles moving from high to low self, okay? So we've got that simple diffusion. No energy, no carrier. Now, we have something called facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is also passive. That means it does not require energy, so we don't need any ATP. It uses the kinetic energy of that concentration gradient. However, it does require a carrier protein or a channel protein. And so a carrier protein, what's going to happen is it's going to, so let's say we were on the outside of the cell membrane here, the protein is going to actually change shape, and then it's going to move the particle to the inside of the membrane. So again, we don't need energy for this, but we do need a carrier protein to help transport that particular particle across the cell membrane. Now, you have also these channel proteins. Channel proteins are literally what they sound like. There are these channels, and they are specific for different particles and nutrients. So we have potassium channels and we have sodium channels. And so those channels, they can be called, we have different types. We have leakage channels. Those are always open. There's no gates. So there's movement of particles, and particles will move what? From high concentration to low. They'll move to down that concentration gradient because that's how particles like to move. Now, we also have gated protein channels, and there's two types of gates. So we have electrically gated channels, and we have chemically gated channels. Let's describe these really quickly. An electrical gated channel is a channel where we get a binding, electrically gated channel is the charge changes and the gate opens up. And when the gate opens up, then we can move that substance through the channel. So electrical gated, the charge changes, gates open up, particle moves in or out if we're talking about a different particle, okay? So it can go either direction. So a great example of that is, we'll see in the muscle chapter, is sodium and potassium, right? When the charge hits -55, all these sodium gates open, sodium floods in. We go to about +30, potassium gates open while sodium gates close. So these charges are determining the opening and closing of these gates. They're electrically gated. A chemically gated channel is a channel where a particle, or we're going to say a neurotransmitter or a hormone or a chemical messenger is going to bind to the protein receptor, and that is going to, right? We open the channel, and now the particle can move through. So we'll see a great example of that in the muscle chapter when acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, is going to bind to these receptors, these protein receptors. Don't forget the receptors are protein. So we have protein carriers, protein channels, and they can be gated or non-gated, okay? So those are our examples for facilitated diffusion, right? So think that these proteins are facilitating the transport of that particle, chemical, across the membrane, all right? Now we have osmosis. Osmosis is also a passive process. Now we said that particles like to move from high to low self. So we could say in osmosis that water likes to move from high water to low water, which is true, but I'd rather, for anatomy and physiology, I would rather us think of it in reference to particles. Where does water want to move in reference to particles? Well, I look at particles as introverted. If we have a lot of sodium on this side of the membrane, it wants to go to the other side where there's less sodium, so it doesn't want to be around a lot of sodium, right? Water is extroverted. Water wants to go where there's a lot of particles. And so if we have a lot of dissolved particles on one side of the membrane, so a higher solute concentration, which is your osmolarity or your osmolality, depending on which measure you're using. But that simply means the concentration of solute particles dissolved in that substance, okay? And so water wants to move where it's more concentrated, which means water wants to move where it has a higher osmolality, okay? So water moves to the side of higher osmolality. That is always going to be the more concentrated side as far as particles. So water wants to move from high water to low water as far as the concentration is concerned, but it wants to move from low particles to high particle concentration because it always moves toward the higher concentration, again, the higher osmolality, okay? So that's the direction water wants to go. That's the concentration gradient for water. It moves two ways. We can actually passively simple diffusion, where we move it directly through the cell membrane. Some water diffuses that way. And then we also have a facilitated type of diffusion where we use these proteins called aquaporins. And the aquaporins, again, are these protein channels. And so that's going to facilitate the movement of water across the membrane. A great example of this, when we talk in the kidney chapter, we say there's a hormone called ADH, antidiuretic hormone. It actually stimulates the building of these protein channels so we can pull more water across from the kidneys back into the blood. A detailed process we'll cover later, but that is important to understand for osmosis. We can move it directly through simply, or we can move it through facilitated by a protein channel. The protein channel is called an aquaporin. So that takes care of our passive processes. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the active processes and active transport. Stay strong. I'll see you next time.